Ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm going to speak in English, but
No problem.
if you want, I can use 2 or 3 other community languages, obviously. French, German, Spanish, Dutch, and I'll make some effort in other languages. Thank you very much for inviting me. Actually, I think this is a very interesting format, having the former members and then the future generation, as you said, Mr. President, here in this meeting to speak about migration. And I think you labeled this as, what did you say, una cuestión caliente?
Yeah,
it's a hot topic, a hot issue. But this is, it's quite interesting because had you invited me probably half a year ago, I would have probably politely declined the invitation because I would have told you that I'm absolutely not in charge of migration issues. My area of responsibility is to be in charge of cooperation, development aid, economic cooperation with Northern Africa and the Middle East. And at that time, I would have thought that probably migration is something which you should discuss with the UNHCR, indeed, and with DG Home in the European Commission, and with probably a couple of other services. But I would have said that probably my area of the world is not really so much touched by migration because, if anything, it is just a transit area of migration to Europe. And I would have thought of Libya. Now, what I've learned, in a way, the hard way over the past months is that we have one phenomenon which has changed its name over the past months. And actually, this seems to be a new feature for EU policies. We know, for example, just to take another example, that we are in a big crisis since 2008. Although I have the impression that the name of this crisis always changes. It started as a banking crisis. It became a currency crisis. It was then labeled a euro crisis. Then it was a debt crisis. Some people call it a Greece crisis. There is always the crisis, but we don't know exactly what it really is. It evolves. And the same thing is true for migration. So still half a year ago, I was in charge, in my own perception, of formulating the European response to what we call the Syrian crisis. Now, what is Syria? Syria is a country in civil war since 2011. In Syria, according to United Nations indications, there are 13.5 million people in need of international assistance. Of these 13.5, 4.2 have fled the country, and most of them are in neighboring countries, more than 2 million in Turkey, about 1.2 million in Lebanon, that's 1/4 of the total population, about 600,000, 650,000 officially registered in Jordan, but in reality the number of Syrians in Jordan is higher because there were many Syrians in Jordan before that never registered as refugees. There's a sizable number in Egypt, there are many, of course, in Iraq. And at that time, I would have thought, okay, Michael, you have to deal with the European response to the Syrian crisis, but also to the refugee crisis. Now, as from September, everybody tells me that I'm also in charge of migration issues. Because those people who we called refugees, by deciding that they should not stay in the camps in the north of Jordan, for example, or in the kind of makeshift camps in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, or in Turkey, but making their way now through the Western Balkans, Greece, Western Balkans, into the European Union, into the heart of the European Union, Austria, Germany, Belgium, and so forth, Scandinavia, Sweden, and Denmark. By that fact, so to say, something which started off as a geopolitical crisis in an area which many people thought was rather remote has become something which touches very much on what is happening inside the European Union. And therefore, in my public presentations, I tend to say, just to make this a little bit more plastic, that we are now in a situation where for the first time since 1962, since the independence of Algeria, we are in a situation where developments in Europe's neighborhood can bring governments inside the European Union to fall. Because what was considered a foreign policy issue has become a domestic issue. If you are Polish, if you're German, if you're Danish, Swedish, you understand, so to say, how hot this topic is, not only as a societal issue, but even for the survival of governments. And I think this is a little bit behind this change of nomenclatura, where we say, well, from a civil war problem in Syria, which triggers refugees. We are now in a situation where these refugees have become migrants, and migrants means they come to us. Of course, only a small percentage of them, but still a percentage which we see as a true socio-economic and political challenge in many member states of the European Union, and which has created a degree of nervousness inside the European Union, because we're all questioning, so to say, whether we have strong enough a level of cohesion inside the European Union and strong enough a level of solidarity between the member states in the European Union so that we would be able to formulate a joined-up response, so to say. So a degree of nervousness that I've never seen before in the 21 years that I work in the European institutions, not even in the toughest days of the, debt, banking, Greek currency, and so forth crisis. Now, this means that the European Union is confronted with a completely new reality. Of course, migration was a reality before. It has always been. Many of our member states, of course, have a strong migratory tradition. Think of Ireland. Or as a German citizen, I know that, for example, in the 19th century, a large part, about 10% of the German population emigrated to North America, to South America. At the same time, the same level, the same number of population was replaced by people coming in from the Russian Empire or from Italy settling in Germany. So it is part of European history that there is migration, ex and in, inside and outside. But the question is, of course, how sudden is it done? Is it done in a regulated way? Is it done in such a way that the economy and the society of our member states can respond to this? And I think this is in a way what we perceive as very challenging in this particular situation right now. It is not necessarily the absolute number of migrants. It is not even perhaps their cultural background. I think it is rather the feeling that it comes all of a sudden. We are not prepared, neither psychologically nor mentally, nor with our kind of welcoming and hosting capacities. And I think this is the central challenge right now, which needs to be addressed. And if you look at the response that the European Union is trying to formulate, both in its internal policies but also in its external relations policies, the common denominator that I perceive in this is basically not to undo this phenomenon, not to limit it, but in a way to make it structured, to make it digestible, to create a framework that would help us to live with it in terms of administrative capacity, political capacity, but also in terms of giving our own citizens, the 500x million that we have in the European Union, the impression, the feeling, the certainty that this is a phenomenon that is under control, with its societal consequences, but also when it comes to at least perception of an increase of risk of criminality or change of the structures and values that form our society. Now, if you run through the individual measures that the European Union has decided upon in the past months, I think you will find many individual examples to illustrate this fact. On the internal policy front, so I'm now venturing into the territory of my colleagues in DG Home, and I apologize for that. In a way, what we see is, for example, the temporary introduction of border controls in Austria, in Germany, in Slovenia, in Hungary, in Sweden. And of course also decisions like the one of Slovenia and Croatia, for example, on the 19th of November to completely close their border to migrants, not all of them, but those originating from other countries than Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. You always need to check whether this is possible on the operational level. But you see already that in complete compliance, by the way, with the legal acquis of the European Union and also the Schengen acquis for those countries that form part of Schengen, countries try to differentiate. Countries try to figure out who are the refugees that are in need of legal protection and that need to be assisted and that have a title to spend some time in the European Union, at least until the authorities in charge can check whether they have a legal title to asylum or at least to be tolerated, and those who obviously do not. So this guides in a way the response on the domestic front. You have also, of course, the introduction of hotspots Now, there is a lot of uncertainty about the right terminology and what it means. People speak about hotspots, people speak about transition zones. There's a lot of political bickering with these expressions. But the central idea is, of course, that you should have areas where refugees or migrants can report to, where they can get registered, screened, where we can get impressions on how many they come. And from where on, you can trigger formal asylum procedures. And you can coordinate on a European level what happens to them, whether they would be relocated inside the European Union or whether, for example, their request for asylum has to be turned down. You know that those hotspots were initially created in Italy and Greece, and as the first two member states where the approach was implemented, and the idea was that the European Union would assist both countries, for example, through migration management support teams that are active, that help the administration in those hotspots in order to deal with the situation. Countries also receive assistance through Frontex or the European Asylum Support Office in Malta. And then there was the very difficult decision to be taken to relocate 160,000 refugees. Now, on the one hand, the relocation of 160,000 that have arrived in Greece and in Italy is a relatively small number if you compare that with the total of refugees or migrants reaching the European shores. Already by September, Frontex reported about 750,000 illegal border crossings. Now we are in the beginning of December. I don't have the latest figures, but I'm sure we have clearly exceeded 1 million already. So the question is what happens with them, what to do with them, and how to display European solidarity in treating their very often very justified cases. And you all know, following the subject closely, how hot this discussion was at the European Council level between the heads of state and government, because obviously behind the relocation mechanism, much more important than the figure, but we all know the figure of 160,000 just sets a precedent on which you can build in the future. Behind the figure was the question, is that a matter for European solidarity? Is that something which we are going to tackle together, jointly? Are countries that still think that they are not on the kind of migration trail, are they ready to offer their assistance to help those who are more centrally concerned? And I personally think this is a very, very important test not only for the cohesion of the European Union, but also for the ability of the 28 member states of the European Union to shape their future together. I also believe that it is a test in political farsightedness, because I'm intimately convinced, although I cannot prove it, that you have member states that are very much concerned by the migration wave these days, but you have others who are not. Those who are not concerned. They are not yet concerned. Because what we have seen over the past 6 months is how quickly the migration tracks change. Had we had this discussion 5 years ago, we would have spoken about the Canary Islands, Ceuta and Melilla. Had we spoken half a year ago, we would have spoken about Libya, boat people, Lampedusa, Malta and Sicily. Now we are speaking about Greek islands like Lesbos, Leros and so forth. We are speaking about the Western Balkans track. But where is the guarantee that refugees would not start tomorrow, for example, to go into Ukraine and from Ukraine into Poland, or to cross, for example, through Romania? So I don't believe that there's a single member state that is in a way protected from being all of a sudden a center, so to say, of this development, suffering then with all the organizational, financial, political and societal consequences. So it is an important test for European solidarity, and therefore Europe has tried to formulate a couple of answers. I already mentioned the hotspots. Of course, you know about the joint maritime operations in the Mediterranean, Triton and Poseidon, and so forth, the EuroNAVFOR Med, now off the coast of Libya. You also know that the agencies like Frontex have been kind of beefed up. All this remains largely insufficient in view of the challenge, but at least you see that the kind of bureaucratic and administrative machinery tries to get ready. What is really important in this context is that we do not content ourselves with a kind of policing response or asylum law response inside the European Union. But there has been, since the adoption of the European Agenda on Migration in April, a growing recognition that if you want to tackle migration, you need to have a comprehensive approach. And this comprehensive approach needs to deal with migration as a phenomenon inside Europe, in the countries of origin, and, very importantly, in the transit countries. So you have, in principle, 3 categories of countries where you have to intervene. And therefore, migration has not only become, let's say, a mainstream priority for domestic policy making in the European Union, but it has also become a mainstream priority for development policy, for foreign policy, including foreign security policy, and for what we call neighborhood policy, which is some sort of hybrid, where these various policies go into one, and where we try to respond centrally to the needs of our direct neighbors, our direct partners. In this respect, I would like to refer to the communication adopted by the Commission last week, on the 18th, or 2 weeks ago, on the 18th of November, the revision of the European neighbourhood policy, where again, migration is singled out as one of the major topics for European foreign policy and development policy action in the southern and the eastern neighbourhood. We need to have instruments for that. We need to have first a joint policy basis, and then instruments to intervene. Joint policy basis, that was one of the reasons why on 11 and 12 November, President Tusk, President Juncker called together more than 30 heads of state and government from the African continent in La Valletta to have a conference to address basically the full problem of migration, the root causes, the way how we can address legal migration and make it possible, how we can provide legal protection to those who need this legal protection, and also how we can reinforce the link between development and migration. Because that is something interesting. Macroeconomists will always tell you that statistically it is proven that migration is a very good thing for growth and economic development. The problem is only, once you're in such a crisis, you don't feel it. It's a long-term effect. But in reality, migration is something extremely good for the migrants, for the host communities, and for the relatives of the migrants that will benefit from workers' transmittances and so forth in the future. The question is how to bring this fruit to bear, how this really make to happen. And therefore, Valletta concluded with a couple of concrete actions. One of the actions is that the European Commission has in the meantime decided to create a major trust fund, the European Emergency Trust Fund, with an initial allocation of 1.8 billion euros for 5 years, which should be matched one by one with the same amount of money from EU member states, and which should operate in 3 windows. One is the Sahel window for Western Africa. The second one is the Horn of Africa window for the east of Africa, and the third one, the Northern African window. That is the one I'm responsible for, where, of course, the problems are different. So with this fund, we will be able to create better livelihoods, better working possibilities in countries like Burkina Faso and so forth, so to address some of the root causes of migration. But we will also be possible to support partners, for example, such as Tunisia, such as Morocco, in setting up their own national migration and asylum policies, in establishing better border controls, and in helping them to create a more welcoming environment for those refugees who stay for a couple of months, a year, or perhaps definitely on the ground of their national territory. Final remark, if you allow me, Mr. President, this is just one trust fund. Before that, we had already created the so-called Madad Fund, which is the European Trust Fund in response to the Syrian crisis. We had yesterday here in Brussels the second meeting of the board of the Madad Fund. In the Madad Fund, we have now the European Union plus 17 member states of the EU. The last one to come on board was Spain yesterday. And we have now a total investment sum of 645 million euros that we use for projects in support of the needs of the Syrian refugees wherever they are. Initially, of course, this fund focused very much on refugee action in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Lebanon. Now it will extend its operations into Iraq, and it will also start to operate in Western Balkans countries outside the European Union to deal with livelihood issues. We spend 50% of the money on education because half of the refugees from Syria are at school age, and we don't want to risk a lost generation because that's the best fertile ground to create more radicalization, more terrorism, and so forth. We invest in water projects. But we also invest in the future of the people, because actually those who leave the camps right now, come to Europe, do not come because there is fighting in the camps. They do not come because they're fighting in Syria, although some of them will therefore flee. They come because they have spent 2 or 3 years in the camps and they don't see a perspective. They don't see the possibility that they could go back to Syria in 1 or 2 months or 1 or 2 years. They have given up hope for themselves, but also for their families. Just imagine if you're, as in my case, a father of 3. You have spent 2 or 3 years in a refugee camp. Either you're lucky and there is an EU-financed school, operated by UNICEF perhaps, or you are unlucky and your kids don't even attend school. How much patience will you have? You will wait a year, year and a half, 2 years. At some point you say, no, I don't have the leisure of offering more time to my family. If I want to guarantee a future for my family, I have to go where they have a future. And the best place there is Europe. So they will go. They will take the last money that they have, buy a ticket and go to Istanbul, and from there buy a trafficker to bring them over into Greece. So if you want to keep people in the region, and that is what was discussed last Sunday with Mr. Erdogan here in Brussels at the EU-Turkey summit, and that is what we are discussing now with Lebanon and with Jordan, is you need to create a perspective for refugees in their region that starts with a perspective of getting work permits. Secondly, work possibilities. There needs to be investment. Thirdly, education, school. And then also all the things that are necessary for a dignified life, like, for example, water, sanitation, electricity, and so forth. For us, I think this is a very good deal. Helping those countries to host the refugees, and once again, you have 4 million refugees in the region, does not only help to stabilize our partner countries, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, but helps also at a much cheaper price, actually, to keep the migrants in their own cultural region. If you have them in Europe, this will cost us 10 times more already in terms of financial effort, and sometimes the political effort will be even more expensive than that. Maybe I can keep it at that, Mr. President.
Thank you.